when we're talking about managing, you've all had managers at some point, but you haven't necessarily had great leaders. And so when we're talking about managing people, we are talking about managing tasks, really. They're task oriented, focusing on getting things done. And this is certainly necessary. But the difference between managing and leading is more about influence. We talked about power and influence the other day. And with influence, we're really after trying to get people to not just micromanaging people to try to get a task done that day, but trying to motivate them to not just understand how to do their job, but agree that it should be done and want to go above and beyond to do it. So the main difference between management and leadership is you don't necessarily have to influence or motivate anyone to be able to manage them. You can say, okay, I need you to complete this task exactly in this way. And somebody might not be that motivated or might not be that inspired by you. But if you help to lead them, if you show them a vision for the future and the role that they play in that vision, then they might be a little bit more inspired, a little bit more motivated. So this is just, we're talking really broadly now. We'll talk more specifically on how to do this later on today. Early on in the early 1800s, Charles Darwin's cousin came up with the idea of the great man theory. And essentially what he said is that you're born, we're each born possessing different traits. And these are necessary for us to be productive and effective leaders. So if you're not born with these traits, then you can't be effective. And that's for a long time what we thought. As research progressed and we got better at distinguishing correlation versus causation and understanding this concept a bit more, we were able to dig in deeper and find out that traits do matter, but it's interesting how they matter. So what we found is that these traits that you see here, self-confidence, self-monitoring, sociability, high energy, dominance, intelligence, tolerance for ambiguity, all of these are important to leadership. However, they don't make you an effective leader. So what I mean by that is that if you're high on these things, if you're okay with ambiguity, if you're highly dominant, if you're really intelligent, these things are going to make it more likely that you'll become a leader. But they're not going to necessarily make you an effective leader. And so that's really what we found here, is that traits matter, but they only matter to the extent that if you possess these different traits, then you're more likely to emerge as a leader. People are more likely to choose you to become a leader. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an effective leader. In fact, we haven't found any real combination of traits that, there's no special formula for saying this person's going to be an excellent leader and this person's not going to be. So traits are important, not because they make you a good leader, but because you're more likely to be selected as a leader if you possess those traits. So what does matter? We know that behavior matters a lot more than traits. And so in a study of over 1,000 leadership behaviors, we found that there are two that are most effective in terms of being a leader. So the first is called initiating structure, and the second is called consideration. And now you can think about these simply as the first is task-oriented, the second is people-oriented. So with initiating structure, you are trying to define tasks for employees and focusing on goals. So you're doing a lot of things that we've talked about in the past regarding motivation and power. But so essentially what this is saying is that what a good leader does in terms of behaviors is they do things like try to clarify what someone's role is. They try to remove roadblocks to make sure that people have what they need to get things done. For example, if you were in this situation with a shipwreck and you're a leader, ideally you would have had your boss or your leader give you opportunities to receive training on this type of thing, to manage this type of role. And in the same way, let's say we have an employee who wants to take on a larger role in the organization. Like at GE, they have a 2-year management training program where you work in different functional areas in the organization, like finance, IT, accounting, marketing. And you do each one of these for a few months. And the idea is that by the time you're done, you understand better how the organization works and you can move up in the organization. So a good, if you're trying to grow and develop your employees, you give them these opportunities so that they can grow into leadership roles. And consideration, this is really a lot of what we talked about in terms of interactional justice or fairness, treating people with dignity and respect, being attentive to them, being present with your employees. Consideration is all about trying to build trust and rapport with your employees, to try to build reciprocity. This idea of reciprocity is that if you treat someone some way, they're more likely to treat you the same in return. And a good leader would try to show respect and treat their employees well, so that in turn they are treated this way and they treat other employees that way. So these basic leadership behaviors, that can just be broken down into task-oriented and people-oriented behaviors. So this is good. Now we're starting to get an idea of, generally what behaviors matter, but still not enough information to really be an effective leader. So what I want to talk to you now is these two main approaches to leadership. And these are really important because we found that the most effective leaders tend to exhibit these types of leadership. And so the first is transformational leadership. So does anyone have any familiarity with this transformational leadership? Okay, and that's totally fine. So when we're talking about transformational leadership, we're talking about really a leader that is able to transform an organization by creating a vision, by communicating well with their employees and inspiring employees to strive for that vision. So what's the difference between, say, a vision and a mission? Well, this is something that's often confused, so completely fine if you're unsure of it. So when we're talking about a vision, we're talking about where, as a leader, you see the organization in the future. When we're talking about mission, we're talking about how we're going to get there. So my vision might be to be if I'm Netflix, for example, my vision might be to be one of the top entertainment companies in the world in the next 5 years. And my mission is how I'm going to get there. It might be increasing market share in this area or that area. It might be coming out with more Tiger Kings so I can get more viewers. In fact, when we're looking at transformational leadership, when we look at the CEOs of Netflix and Amazon, I mean, these are great examples of people who have really transformed not just their organization, but their industry. Most of you don't remember, but Netflix started by mailing out DVDs when Blockbuster and everyone else, you had to go in and get them. And so essentially they took this and they said the CEO of Netflix, he was a software engineer before he took on this role, and he always had this vision for how he saw the entertainment industry moving. And he thought, well, if we can stream this, we're going to save a lot of money. People don't have to go and pick stuff up. We don't have to mail things. And so he had this vision early on, and he communicated that to his employees and helped to motivate them to say, hey, you're going to change the world if you do this. And so this is much different, as you can imagine, than somebody who's managing. Just saying, okay, we need to get 100 orders fulfilled today. Not telling you why, not telling you what they're for, not telling you your purpose or the vision of the organization. Just saying, okay, today we need to do this. It's a very different. They're both necessary. You need to be focusing on everyday tasks, but without that overall vision, without that mission, in order to get there, then a lot of your employees are going to be sort of lost. They're not going to feel that they have much of a purpose in what they're doing, and they're less motivated as a result. So people who have transformational leaders, they tend to be more satisfied, more optimistic, less likely to turn over, and they have more trust in their leader. And so how do you become a transformational leader? Well, there are 6 ways that we can do this. So first is we have to articulate a vision. When I talked to you guys about Tony Hsieh, the CEO of Zappos, so when he was at Link Exchange, he sold it to Microsoft for over $100 million. And Microsoft had given him essentially a bonus of about $10 million if he stayed for 12 months. And one day he woke up This was he had like 2 or 3 months left, I think, on his contract. He woke up and he decided he didn't want to be there anymore. At this point, he was rich, but he wasn't, he wasn't uber rich. I mean, he had other people had a stake in the company, and so he didn't get all of that $100 or so million. Um, and he decided that he didn't like the culture he created. He didn't like the company that he was working for, and he didn't want to waste another day doing something that he wasn't passionate about. And so he walked in and quit that day, giving up his $10 million bonus that he would have gotten if he had stayed just a little bit longer. This sounds crazy, right? And so when he started Zappos, he started this with the idea that the vision that he had really mattered. It was super important because he didn't want to work for a company or have a culture that he didn't believe in. So he was very clear early on that, this is going to be a company where we're going to um, we're not just going to sell a product, but the way in which we do it, the way in which we hire, it's all going to be around the values and the vision that I have for this organization. So you'll notice if you order anything on Zappos, it's a very different culture than you find in most organizations. So first, you want to articulate a vision. So what is the vision that you have for the organization? And a lot of this should come from top leadership, but it also needs to come from your frontline employees input. If this isn't a company that's just starting out, if you're like Tony Hsieh, where you have the benefit of starting a company and hiring people based on your vision, that's really useful. But most transformative leaders, they're walking into a situation where things might not be great, where if you just change everything, your employees are going to resist. And so for a situation like that, if you're, let's say, a lot of you, when you come out of here, you're going to go into jobs and be managers and leaders. And that's tough to do sometimes, to walk into a company you've never worked for before and have to lead other people. So it can be useful to garner input from your employees and to say, what do you think that, what do you like about working here? What don't you like about working here? What benefit do you think this organization serves? And use that input to help formulate your vision for the future. That's not to say that your employees should have complete control over the direction of the company, but it is to say that you should at least take their input into account, because a lot of times it is going to be valuable, and that helps to get buy-in. So number two, providing an appropriate model. Well, I'll give you one that that you probably have heard of before, but Walmart. So when their executives travel together, they share a hotel room. Now, this is very different from most companies you've heard of. If you're at Spotify, or if you're at, yeah, Netflix, something like that, it's probably not how you're typically traveling. In fact, Spotify, they put people in 5-star hotel rooms, and they are usually flying pretty well. So imagine if you're an executive at Walmart making millions and millions of dollars and you're expected to share a hotel room. That's a big change from the mansion that you probably live in every day. The purpose of this was to provide an appropriate example for other employees, to lead by example. Another example is when I worked at GE, safety is a huge thing. So what they had us do was, even if you weren't in a job that required, extreme safety measures, like my job was recruiting. And so what they had us do is you would always walk in 90-degree turns whenever you were going to your car. Now, this sounds crazy, but they found that if you walk in 90-degree turns and stay to walkways, then you're less likely to get injured on a job. And another thing we would do is we would always check the room for loose wires before starting a meeting. This sounds silly, but what it communicates to people is that safety really matters, that this is a core part of our organization, and everyone does it, no matter what job they're in. So if you want to be a transformative leader, you really have to exhibit the behaviors that you want others to take on. Okay, so fostering the acceptance of group goals. This is kind of an interesting one, and what we want to try to do here is to create super inordinate goals. And what this is a goal that everyone in the organization is working toward together. So you might have in companies, a little bit of competition. For example, salespeople, you might have be able to see people's sales numbers by department, and you might have people competing against each other, and to some degree that's okay. But if people aren't seeing the big picture of what they're really trying to do, then it's going to be pretty difficult to get them to work together and work cooperatively. So you want to establish those SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And you want to establish goals that the entire organization can do to can try to achieve together. One of the ways we do this is through incentive systems, by giving people, for example, stock or bonuses based on the performance of the organization as a whole. Okay. Another is communicating high performance expectations. So you don't want to walk into a new company and tell people that you're completely changing things, that their jobs are totally changing. But the other hand, you don't want to say, okay, everything's acceptable, whatever you've been doing is fine. You want to challenge people, and oftentimes, humans, we have an innate need to be challenged, to learn, to grow. And if you give people a challenge, most of the time they're going to rise up to meet that challenge if they think that they can do it. If we go back to expectancy theory, if people expect that they can achieve some goal and that they're going to be rewarded with something that they value for achieving that, they're more likely to pursue it. So a big part of this is communicating high performance expectations, and also through individualized support and through the way in which you communicate with people to show them that you believe that they're able to achieve this. You're not just giving them some random goals, that you're challenging them because you think that they are capable of doing it. And then lastly, providing intellectual stimulation. So as you may have noticed, with some jobs, you're doing the same monotonous routine thing over and over again, and that can be really boring. So what transformative leaders do is they try to figure out with their employees, hey, where do you want to be? And how can I help you to get there? And so a big part of this is developing their employees, saying, what are the tools that we need you to get? If you're going to be a ship captain, this example, well, there's a lot of learning that needs to be done before you do it, obviously. So what are the tools that you need, and how can I help you to get those? Is a big part of providing intellectual stimulation. So you can do that by paying for your employees' MBA, by doing things like sending employees to trainings, by giving them experience overseas, by giving them different tasks to do in their job that stimulate them. So you need to figure out with your employees which ones are going to work best. So next is transactional leadership. And this is a lot different. When we talked about transformational leadership, we were really talking about someone who is able to inspire and influence others. Transactional leadership is a bit different in that this is more task oriented. So if you go back to initiating, structure, and consideration, those two behaviors that good leaders exhibit, this would be more related to initiating structure, whereas transformational leadership would be more related to consideration, to that people aspect. So when we look at transactional leadership, this is refers to behaviors that followers that motivate followers and promote compliance through rewards and correction. So this relates back to what we talked about with behavior modification. Essentially, what we're using is rewards and sometimes punishments to try to get what we want done. So there are two types of transactional leadership, and this is management by exception and contingent reward. So management by exception, here what you're trying to do is identifying any errors in work and taking corrective action. And contingent reward, you're essentially promising some type of reward for someone if they do a good job on whatever it is you're asking them to do. So in this way, what we're trying to do here is, when you hear the word transactional, essentially it's, if you do this, I'll do this. So there's a transactional relationship in that there's an exchange of goods and services for something promised. And with management by exception, if there is an error, if something doesn't work out well, then as a result, you need to try to take corrective action to change that person's behavior. On the other hand, with contingent reward, if someone does a really good job, they get a bonus. If they don't do a really good job, they don't get that bonus. So these are essentially rewards and punishments. So essentially, when you think about transactional leaders, you want to think, well, why would I do this? We talked about in behavior modification that punishment doesn't really work that well, but that contingent reward is really about positive reinforcement. If you're doing something good, then you get something from it. So that's really beneficial. And then management by exception, if you're doing something that needs to if you're making errors or making mistakes that your manager needs to take corrective action on, this is somewhat related to negative reinforcement, but really it's mainly used if you have employees who are underperforming, who are making pretty big errors, pretty big mistakes. Otherwise, with management by exception, you don't want to be seeking out people making errors. You don't want your employees to fear that you're walking around looking for them to make a mistake. So contingent reward tends to be a better option, but management by exception is necessary when you have underperforming employees. And what it does essentially is it establishes the boundaries, the guidelines for that relationship, because now your employees can say, okay, I see where I stand. If I do something wrong, I'm not going to get away with it, but everyone's treated the same way. We're all being treated consistently. And if I do a good job, then I'm going to get rewarded for it. Okay, so what we've done is we've looked at research so far from the 1800s up until modern day. Transformational and transactional leadership are the most popular methods and most effective methods of managing employees, with transformational being really a bit more effective than transactional, but both are necessary. Just like when we talk about leadership versus management, you need to have both. You can't just be working on a vision all day and trying to inspire and motivate employees and influence them. You also have to be checking on day-to-day activities and making sure that things are getting done. So the last ones that we'll talk about are, these really have to do with moral approaches to leadership. So they have to do with ethics. And we have servant and authentic leadership. And so these have only become popular in the last decade, but they have been found to be fairly effective and certainly worth considering for yourself. So this idea of servant leadership actually came from a professor he was reading a book about a number of people at sea. And I'm just going to read the little excerpt for you. So he was reading Hermann Hesse's Journey to the East. In this novel, a group of men undertook a long journey. A servant named Leo sings to them and inspires them while doing his tasks. Leo disappears along the way, and the group falls into chaos and cannot complete their journey. The basic idea is that followers are first rather than leaders. So the moral of this story is essentially that the team fell apart when they didn't have what was a pretty low-level person in the organization. And this really highlights the importance of followers over leaders, that if you're going to be a good leader, you need to be a servant to your employees. So rather than considering yourself as someone who is always demanding and asking things of your employees, you can consider yourself as someone who serves as a resource, who essentially is there to serve other employees, to help them to have the tools, resources that they need to remove roadblocks and obstacles for them. And to, again, part of this is treating people with dignity and respect, treating them well. So this is very different from a lot of approaches to leadership, but we found that employees tend to really like this. And if you think about it, the reason why as a manager or leader you get a paycheck, you get a bonus, you have all this stuff is because your employees are doing a good job. So why not consider yourself someone as, a servant to them in a way? And what I mean by that is someone who is there to serve them, to make sure that they have the resources and the tools that they need. So rather than putting the leader up on a pedestal, what this does is really put the followers up on a pedestal, and the leader is just someone there who's there to help. So when we look at the different dimensions of servant leadership, we can really break it down to the most important one here is empowering. As a servant leader, you empower your employees. And so how do you do that? How do you empower your employees to get something done? With empowering, here we're giving employees a lot of autonomy in the way that they do their work. We're saying, here are the resources, whatever resources you need to get your job done, I'm going to give those to you. And then I'm going to give you the autonomy that you need to get this job done the way that you see fit. So when we feel empowered, we feel safe. We feel that, hey, I have the resources that I need to do this job. I have the tools that I need. My boss is here to support me, to serve me, and they trust me, and they're willing to let me do this job in the best way I see fit. Now, that's hard to empower your employees because there's a level of trust involved here, and it's difficult to give everyone autonomy in every role. But as much as you can empower them, as much as you can give them autonomy, the tools and the resources that they need, and removing those roadblocks for them, those things are going to be really helpful. Some other ones here that are important are behaving ethically. So again, that leading by example, always putting subordinates first. So not considering yourself as a higher level as others. And one thing to mention here is this is very much culturally sensitive. So this tends to work very well in the US. So, if you're a subordinate, if you're a follower in an organization, it's nice for us to say, okay, we're being put first here. We're being put as at least at an equal level as our bosses. That feels good. But in certain places, like for example, I teach in Hong Kong. So when I'm in Hong Kong, there's a huge power distance between employees and their managers. And employees would feel very uncomfortable if you acted as a servant toward them, if you tried to put them first or put them at the same level as yourself in the hierarchy. So it works really well in the US, but this doesn't work everywhere equally well. So those are really the big ones here. But when you're thinking about being a servant leader, and I recommend that you just try this at work. Try to think about how can you make your employees feel important? How can you put them first? And see how that goes for you. So the last one I want to cover here is authentic leadership. So authentic leadership is something that can be really difficult for some of us. And here you are really understanding, knowing yourself, and behaving in ways that align with your own values and what you believe to be right. So why do you think people aren't always authentic at work? Maybe having other people judge you. If you're acting, if you're showing your true self, there's a risk there, right? Someone could judge you. You could feel bad about yourself. Authentic leadership is something that it's not an easy thing to do for a number of reasons. But when we're being authentic, we're really self-aware, and this is a hard thing to do. Some of us can act in a way that upsets other people, and that we don't even know we're doing it. So being aware of how our behaviors affect other people can be really helpful. In terms of relational transparency, this is a really hard one. Saying exactly what you mean. Now that doesn't mean saying everything. To be an authentic leader doesn't mean you have to go around and just start telling somebody that their dress looks ugly, or that they need this or that. You can pick and choose which things to say. But when you say something, you really mean it. When you're giving someone a compliment at work, when you're praising them, it's because they did a really good job. You really believe in that person. So an internalized moral perspective, this is demonstrating beliefs that are consistent with actions. And so this is, again, goes back to just saying, I am going to do what I say. And so if I tell you something, if I tell you that I believe a certain way, or that something is important to me, then I'm going to act in a way that aligns with that. And then lastly, balanced processing solicits views that challenge his or her deeply held positions. And this is really hard too. I mean, imagine you really believe strongly in something, and we know with confirmation bias that we tend to want to seek out information that supports whatever we believe. And this does just the opposite. It goes against our own inherent biases and says, what if I'm wrong about this? And that can be a hard thing to truly do. I mean, to really say, I'm going to look at things from another perspective, and to say I might be wrong in this situation. But as a leader, that's super important, because you're going to make mistakes. You're going to be wrong at times. But if you're authentic about it, if you say, hey, I looked at this and I was wrong, and this is what I'm going to do differently. Imagine a leader that says that to you. Imagine a manager that says that to you, that they've considered they've considered your input or your feedback, and they're wrong, and this is what they're going to do differently. This is so hard to do, to admit mistakes. And a lot of times it's, going back to that risk taking, as I mentioned, if a lot of people are afraid of, if I admit a mistake or if I say I was wrong, then that'll make me appear weak, or make me appear that I'm not intelligent. And so we've got to take risks. We have to, if you want to be authentic, which we know people really appreciate authentic leaders, then you've got to be willing to risk that people are going to judge you, that you're going to make mistakes, you're going to have to apologize for those mistakes. But it's a continual process of trying to improve yourself, trying to improve your relationships with other people. And at the end of the day, it's a lot easier to do this than to not be authentic. When we talked about deep acting versus surface acting, with surface acting being, just trying to change the way that you sound or you look based on the situation. So, for example, I'm having a bad day as a waiter, but I still smile and tell people hi. That can be hard to do. And so that's why deep acting was more beneficial, when you try to align your beliefs with the way that you're acting. And authentic leadership is much easier than being inauthentic, because the way that you feel, you can show it. The way that what you're thinking, with some exceptions, you can say those things. So when you're an authentic leader, you don't have to constantly worry about, what am I saying, what am I thinking, what am I doing? You're being yourself, and you're acting in ways that align with your belief system. Okay, so we've covered a lot of different types of leadership theories today. As I mentioned, this really started out with this great man theory, that we thought you're born a leader, you're not made a leader. And so we thought you had to have certain traits to be effective. What we've found since then is that that's not the case, that some traits like dominance, intelligence, social ability, these things help you to emerge as a leader. They help your chances of essentially becoming a leader, but they don't necessarily make you more effective as a leader. What we found is that leader behaviors are much more important than traits. So those behaviors related to tasks and related to people. So being able to establish goals for people, supporting them, fostering acceptance toward those goals, giving them the resources that they need, removing roadblocks, and being attentive to your employees, being sensitive with them, treating them with dignity and respect. These things are super important. And those other behaviors that follow come from whatever your leadership perspective is. And it can be a combination of, transformational, transactional, these moral approaches, servant leadership. You don't need to pick one leadership theory and say, I'm going to be this leader. You can just take whatever you like from all of these, because we know these are all effective. So take what works for you from these different theories and try to apply these at work and see how that goes for you. My guess is that it's going to go pretty well. Okay, so that is the end of today's lecture. Thank you